Hi, I'm Micah Halpern. Thank you for joining me today as I do some thinking out loud. Our first segment is called Background Briefing. The first thing I've been thinking about is the role of the United States in the Middle East. It's significant for us to pay attention to because there's a new administration and we have to see what they're doing. The influence of the United States has diminished throughout the Middle East. The vacuum is being filled by China and Russia. It has been a slow and steady process, not the work of one president and one administration. The withdrawal of the United States from the Middle East began with the Obama administration. Candidate Trump ran on a platform of getting U.S. forces out of and allowing locals to handle their own security. And he lived up to his word. Although still in its infancy, it is clear that the Biden administration will not be sending forces into the region. What began as a trend has become a reality. In fact, it is on the ground a reality. The impact of this new reality has had and will continue to have a huge impact on the region. China and Russia are not, to state the obvious, the United States. And the impact of the U.S. withdrawal from the area affects the safety and security of all Western allies in the region, and most of all, Israel. It did not have to be this way. Once the decision to leave the region militarily was made, the United States could have retained influence in the Middle East through assistance and advice. The United States would have been able to wield tremendous influence without putting boots on the ground or in planes or in the sky or anywhere else. It chooses. The administration after administration did not. To the chagrin of China and Russia, and I'll add Iran to that list, the United States is still the only superpower in the world. And most countries in the Middle East would have welcomed continued involvement in whatever form the United States wished to offer their assistance. Being included in the sphere of a superpower offers both protection and respect from other countries. But that is a thing of the past. It will not be easily restored. In the Middle East, the United States' influence has literally evaporated. The equation has changed. The rules of engagement have changed. Whereas the United States played the role of big brother or little brother states, in the region, China and Russia play the role of boss, big boss, and underling. For non-Western countries, that works. It's a relationship they feel comfortable with. Russia and China have opened their arms, and several countries, most notably Turkey and Iran, have rushed into their embraces, knowing full well all that it entails. Turkey and Iran imagine themselves to be in the image of Russia and China, not content to exist side by side with their neighbors. They are big believers in expansion. And now, knowing that there will be no blowback or pushback from the big brother, the United States, they are biding their time and waiting to pounce and expand their borders. Turkey has set their targets on Syria. They've already created a temporary security zone on the Syrian land and will take it a step further and encroach directly into the country soon. Iran has set its sights on Iraq. Both Syria and Iraq are too weak to repel or even to challenge these interlopers. It is a done deal. Russia and China are not concerned about border expansions of this nature. In their worlds, it's commonplace. Israel, on the other hand, works off the Western model where security, not just their own security, but security of the entire region, is paramount. Israel needs to figure out how and what their next steps are going to be given the changes taking place around them. And they have a plan. Israel has embarked on a creative mission, experimenting with new models of interaction and new global alliances. We've watched it happen over the past few months. Israel's creating alliances with non-hostile Arab nations, and more alliances are on the horizon. Jump-starting the process with the Abraham Accords was, it turns out, an unanticipated parting gift of the Trump administration. These alliances are not only significant for economic benefits, they bring Israel and her new partners together. They will also provide significant security benefits to the lone Jewish state in the region, and even offer backup and support in reigning in Turkey and Iran, and other non-nation actor states who want to destroy Israel and upset the region. Israel diplomatically and militarily is friendly with Russia and China, but Israel knows that they are not trustworthy. Israel understands that they each act purely in their own interest. There are no ideals and ideologies in Russian and Chinese foreign policy. There are only goals and strategies. The United States often makes decisions based on ethical and moral principles. They tended to lecture and preach from a high and mighty moral ground, and that insulted many regional players. Many countries in the Middle East are not distressed that the United States is gone. They welcome their new reality implemented by China and Russia. China and Russia have similar interests. They act together and they act independently, oftentimes at the same time, both together and apart. Israel will use this. Israel needs to be friendly with the major influencers in the region. Long before this shift in power became a reality, Israel had established good working relations, first with Russia and more recently with China. Israel is now engaged in expanding those relationships. Israel wants to show that they can be useful to both China and Russia in helping them achieve their goals in the region. Israel also wants to impress upon them, both of them, the importance of reigning in Iran or any other country intent on destroying the status quo of the region. The relationships are mutually beneficial. Certainly, there is a security issue. Dovetailing with that are expanding and expansive markets. Russia and China will gain access to Israel's great intellectual capital, technology, and creativity. It is not an ideal situation. It is the situation. If the United States continues in this vein, it will be the blueprint for the future of more and more countries around the world. China and Russia should thank the United States, but that's not their style. Just as I've been doing for the past year plus, I've also been thinking about, of course, COVID. Israel has detected a new Nigerian variant of the COVID. This variant is so closely related to the South African variant, the strength of the variant is still being studied. These variants are extremely dangerous. They are growing in number, and it is not certain that any of our vaccines will protect people against these new and newer variants. As far as we know, the United Kingdom, New York, South Africa, Brazilian, and now the Nigerian variants are out there. It appears that vaccines, to some extent, do provide protection against the UK, New York, South African variants. The Brazilian and the Nigerian ones are still in question, big question marks to be determined. The pandemic is not yet behind us. We need to be vigilant and we need to be cautious. Coming up next, points of view. I want to discuss two columns today. One is from the Jerusalem Post and the other is from ynet.com. That's Yidiot's online service. First up is a column from the Jerusalem Post. It's entitled, Failure to Stop Iran's Terror. Support might lead to Israel-Hezbollah war. And it's subtitled, To Understand the New Complex Middle Eastern Puzzle, it is first necessary to recognize the fact that the Biden administration is dealing with Iran on two fronts. This column was written by Eitan Dangot and was published on March 21st, 2021. Dangot is a retired Israeli major general. Dangot begins, The Middle East has entered a new and significant stage in recent weeks, as all regional actors position themselves around the key question of whether or not U.S. President Joe Biden's administration renews the Iran nuclear agreement. Failure to achieve an improved nuclear deal and cause Iran to downgrade its regional destabilizing activities will have long-lasting effects, could create an economic disaster in Iran, and could lead to a military escalation between Iran and America's regional allies. The issue of whether sanctions on Iran will be lifted and the outline of a possible new agreement is the leading factor that will shape the face of the Middle East in the coming years. Dangot now explains that there are two essential issues that must be addressed with Iran, and that these two issues must be solved together as one. He writes, To understand the new complex Middle Eastern puzzle, it first is necessary to recognize the fact that the Biden administration is dealing with Iran on two fronts. The first is Tehran's radical activities and support for armed movements that stretch from Yemen through Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, as part of a grand strategic attempt to change realities in the region. The second is Iran's nuclear program. Every attempt by the United States to solve one of these fronts without linking it to the other is doomed to fail. Don Goth explains that Iran is not changing, that Iran continues to work to achieve their goals despite all pressure that is being applied. He puts it this way: ultimately, Washington should view the spread of the Shiite axis, its weapons proliferation and proxy consolidation program, as being inseparable from the nuclear deal. The Iranians have proven and continue to prove that despite severe pressure from multiple directions, the pandemic, economic distress, their scheme to expand, terror tentacles, and their murderous radical ideology will not stop even for a second. Don Goth concludes by writing this point, and it is essential. Only a combination of a firm stance in negotiations, the listing of conditions, a show of force, and leaving space for maneuver will pave the path to a contraction of Iran's nuclear program and a curtailment of its regional activities. A U.S. failure on these counts could well lead Israel to consider a variety of operations against Iran and its militias, including the option of launching a preventive offensive against Hezbollah. Wow. Next up is a column from Ynet, and it's written by Tamir Pardo. Pardo was the former head of the Mossad. His column was published on March 6, 2021. The column is entitled, "Israel Needs Coherent Strategy on Iran and Palestinians." Subtitled, "As a regional military power, Israel should set policy based on comprehensive evaluation of national interest and not by improvisation, casting off the essential fear that the shadow of the Holocaust of yore." When the former head of the Mossad lays out an opinion, it's worth listening to even if you disagree. And that's critical here. Pardo offers a devastating attack on the defensive status of Israel. He writes, "Israel lacks a comprehensive national security policy. Its position on Iran's nuclear aspirations was formulated by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu alone, without the consultation with Security Cabinet. Israel's concessions allowing advanced weapon systems, including the F-35 stealth bomber, to be sold to the UAE, and an agreement to allow the sale of advanced submarines to Egypt, were all decided in the same manner. To declare the annexation of West Bank land and the subsequent reversal of this policy was also carried out in a similar fashion. And even the decision to deliver vaccines to certain countries and deny them to our Palestinian neighbors followed the same process." Pardo argues that these decisions were made without the input of Israel's defense leadership. He argues that future decisions must utilize the defense establishment's insight when making decisions. Pardo concludes by writing, "Such a shift in position would then allow Israel to come up with initiatives to halt the slide into binational statehood and even draft agreements on a two-state solution that could be presented further down the road. As Israel approaches the 73rd anniversary of its birth, with unmatched military might and other assets such as technological ingenuity, it is time for the government to recognize it is leading a mature and powerful nation that can decide its own path, firstly by formulating a strategy to guarantee its future national security." Both of these columns, two columns, both about Iran. Iran is on the minds of every serious strategic and defense thinker in the world today, the entire world, not just in the Western world. Coming up next, commentary through cartoons, where pictures tell the story. I want to show you 6 cartoons and memes today. First up is a funny take on the quintessential Swiss Army knife and archaeology. The caption reads, "Archaeological discovery in Switzerland." The Swiss Army knife is an indispensable tool. It has been the go-to knife for everyone since 1891, when the knife was invented and manufactured by Carl Eisener, which later became Victorinox. The name, the Swiss Army knife, was actually coined by US soldiers because they could not easily pronounce the German name of the knife, which was Officersmesser, which means officer's knife. Pi Day is one of those days of the year when math geeks get excited about the calendar. And it's exciting to see that some days during the year, people, math people get excited. This caption on this meme reads, Pi Day is just a fake holiday created by math companies to sell more math. Pi is, the ratio of a circle's circumference to its diameter. Next here is a picture of Tom Selleck, who was the original Magnum PI, Magnum Private Investigator. Pi is 3.14159, and it continues. The number continues into infinity. Pi Day was established by a physicist in San Francisco in 1988. To celebrate Pi Day, math lovers eat pizza, a circle, throw pies, a circle. July 22nd is called Approximate Pi Day because its fraction 22/7 is approximately equivalent to 3.14159. Next up is a bumper sticker. We live in a bumper sticker world. Actually, bumper stickers today are more like magnets that have messages on it. I think this one is hilarious. It reads, legalize recreational plutonium. Next up is a meme, and it pokes fun at our all ubiquitous electronic devices, which are everywhere. That's what ubiquitous means. Everyone, everywhere has these phones, tablets, everything. Going into a coffee shop, and people have their heads down deep into their electronic devices. The meme reads, I saw a guy at Starbucks today. No iPhone, no tablet, no laptop, no book. He just sat there drinking coffee like a psychopath. Imagine that. And finally, a real sign that, like many signs, is very problematic. When signs are misphrased or when words are not spaced properly, the warnings and the messages instead become change from being very serious to being very, very funny. Here is the perfect example. The sign is supposed to be a warning to hunters to be careful of pedestrians. But instead, the sign actually reads, hunters, please use caution when hunting pedestrians using walk trails. That's funny. In a moment, more of my own perspective and a few predictions. Tel Aviv Regional Court ruled that an assistant teacher in a special education program who refused to vaccinate and refused to get tested for COVID can be barred from entering the school. The court ruled that while the personal rights of the assistant teacher are important, those rights cannot encroach on the safety and security of the students and their families. This case will certainly soon appear before Israel's Supreme Court. Hopefully by then, the Israeli Knesset will have passed laws dealing with this issue so that the High Court will rule on the basis of the laws which are passed. They'll have some basis upon which to rule. As of now, in Israel, the rights of the individual do not outweigh the rights of the many. Teachers have the right to say no to both the vaccine and the COVID testing, but they cannot work in schools or in hospitals, let's say. This is also the established law in the United States, and not just as it relates to COVID vaccines. It is about other critical vaccines as well. A good example is response to the outbreak of polio recently, which was thought to have been eradicated in the United States. It happened in the New York City area just several years ago. Both houses of Congress have invited Israeli President Ruvi Rivlin to address a joint session. The invitation is a farewell gesture to the Israeli president, whose term ends on July 9th. This is a wonderful swan song for Rivlin. It also is important because perhaps, most importantly, it's an indication that there is still a strong bipartisan spirit in support of Israel in Congress. COVID will be the determining factor in whether or not President Rivlin comes to Washington. Ruvain, or Ruby as he's referred to, Rivlin, has been a wonderful diplomat for Israel. He has fulfilled his role with grace and dignity. The role of an Israeli president is to generate nonpartisan worldwide support for Israel. And Rivlin has succeeded par excellence. Most recently, he traveled to Europe for talks with heads of state from countries including France, Germany, Austria, Romania, Bulgaria, Portugal. He spoke to them about the plan in the ICC, the International Criminal Court, to prosecute Israel for war crimes. Rivlin was very successful in swaying world opinion. Ruby Rivlin will be leaving large shoes for Israel's next president to fill. According to an AP report, United States intelligence has discovered that Iran was planning a USS Cole-style attack on Fort McNair. The intel, which comes from the NSA, the National Security Agency, also indicated that U.S. Army Vice Chief of Staff was also a target. Fort McNair is in Washington, D.C., literally in the nation's capital. It is in closer proximity to the White House than the Pentagon or the CIA building. Fort McNair is also home to the National Defense University, which includes the National War College. Included is the Capstone program, which brings 100 flag officers from 50 countries around the world to learn together. As a target, it is prime, and that is why it was chosen by Iran. The USS Cole was a U.S. Navy destroyer situated in the Gulf of Aden in Yemen. In October 2000, a rubber boat filled with explosives pulled alongside the destroyer and blew a huge hole in the side of the ship. 17 U.S. sailors were killed. A USS Cole-style attack is an attack against a significant U.S. military target that is a very serious threat. The highly respected medical journal Lancet published a very important peer-reviewed article about reinfection from COVID recently. The research was done in Denmark, and the research challenges the conventional wisdom that you cannot get COVID twice. The Denmark study puts numbers to the possibility of reinfection and to its risks. The study divides people into two major groups, those below 65 and those 65 and older. If you are 65 and under, you have an 80% chance of recovery from second infection. If you're 65 and older, you have only a 47% chance of recovery from a second time infection of COVID. The study explains that contracting COVID the second time is extremely uncommon, but when you get it, it can be dangerous for people over 65. They explain that the new variants need to be studied, and they suggest that new variants might be a reason from contracting COVID a second time. Importantly, the study asserts that should you contract COVID the second time, and if you are over 65, it could be very well life-threatening. Israel conducted an out-of-the-ordinary drone exercise recently. It was not a military program. Instead, it was a test commercial program for delivering commercial materials using small mini drones. The test took place in the city of Hadera, and the computer that controlled it was 35 miles north in Haifa. Drones released 20 at a time delivered pizzas and other small items. The skies of Israel are filled with other drones, with planes, with helicopters, and even with paragliders. Because of all of this air traffic, the rules for delivery drones state that they must fly under 360 feet. Israel's delivery drones have all emergency parachutes in case of malfunctions. Should there be a malfunction, the parachute will make certain that the drone and the package and anyone or anything on the ground will not be damaged. The exercise was successful. It looks like drone deliveries are soon to become a reality in Israel. On Monday, March 15th, an important date, Ichilov Hospital in Tel Aviv closed its last COVID ward. The 18 remaining patients were transferred to other non-COVID units. This is enormously significant. Ichilov is the largest medical center serving Tel Aviv. It is one of the largest medical campuses in Israel itself. It's the second largest, actually. Closing their COVID wards signals that Israel is in the final stretch of the pandemic. Fewer and fewer people are dying of COVID in Israel. Fewer and fewer people are becoming critically ill and requiring hospitalization. Vaccinations have topped 5 million, will hit 7 million in just a few weeks. The lockdowns and quarantines and strict enforcement of rules, restrictions have paid off and lives saved, and the pandemic that has been contained has now nearly come to an end. Good going, Israel. We've been thinking out loud about a lot today. Now that you know what I've been thinking, let me know what you're thinking. Email me at micah@jbstv.org. Tweet me at Micah Halpern. Tell me what you think. Before we end, let me leave you with one piquante piece of information. Have you ever wondered why the International Criminal Court, or the ICC, or The Hague, as it's sometimes called, is so anti-Israel? The answer to the question, we have to ask another question. Why was the ICC so quiet on Israel during the Trump administration? Here's the answer. The ICC is political. It tests the winds and takes its direction from political powers. The prevailing wind is not pro-Israel. Under Trump it was. President Joe Biden has made a passing statement that he does not support the ICC prosecution of Israel, but he has not advocated for Israel. And that's a big difference. Under this administration, it is clear that the U.S. is tepid so far with regard to the ICC and Israel. The very purpose of the Israeli President Rivlin's trip to Europe was to sway popular opinion and the leadership of Europe to step up on this issue. The hardest thing for us to understand is that indeed the ICC, a court, an international court, is swayed not by evidence, but by popular opinion. This is a very reason why Israel does not recognize the ICC's jurisdiction. I think that in this, Israel acts wisely. Thank you for thinking out loud with me, Micah Halpern. Let's think out loud again next week on JBS.